Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here once again with Professor Steve Saideman from Carleton University because he's not only our military guy, but he's also a NATO guy. He wrote his third book on NATO, and that's kind of a big deal right now with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. So I figured we'd kind of get him to give us a sense of what's going on. Where there's a lot of stuff right now where everyone keeps asking about why don't they declare a no-fly zone. Steve's got some very good opinions about that. So why don't we start with that?
Well, NATO or not NATO, a no-fly zone involves establishing control over an airspace so that way the other side can't fly into it. And that requires two things. It requires the willingness to shoot down other people's planes and the willingness and need to actually destroy the other side's anti-aircraft capability on the ground, because you don't want your planes to get shot down while you're enforcing the no-fly zone. Either or both of those acts would be pretty warlike when the opponent is Russia. When it's Afghanistan, Libya, there's not a whole lot of aircraft to worry about, not a whole lot of anti-aircraft capability to worry about. But when you're dealing with either Syria, which is why we didn't do a no-fly zone there, or dealing with Russia, that forces you to have to do things like shoot down Russian planes and shoot and blow up Russian artillery, anti-aircraft weapons on the ground. And either of those two things, I think Putin might take a bit of offense at. And we are trying to avoid World War III. And attacking Russians would not be a good way to avoid World War III.
Yeah, so that kind of leads us to what kind of a situation are we finding ourselves in? Because what kind of aid can we give Ukraine without involving ourselves in the actual conflict?
And that's a good question. And of course, the Russians will say no aid. Anything that you do is warlike. But just as Putin is trying to find a line where he can do whatever he wants without getting retaliation, we are also trying to find a place where we can do stuff that won't lead to a catastrophic response. So arming the Ukrainians is something we've already done and we can do more of. Do we do cyber attacks on behalf of the Ukrainians? Would that be something that Putin would find not to be a massive escalation? I'm not sure. Are we already doing that? That might be going on. Sharing intelligence is certainly something we could do, and I don't think that's something that Putin would escalate over. The challenge is, how do you do things that don't cause this thing to spread beyond Ukraine or to get more violent than it already is? And it's obviously pretty violent, but it could get worse, right? The level of intensity could go up. And so the question is, what kinds of things do you pick? So right now the Russians are threatening economic sanctions against us, and there are things they can do that might be harmful to our economic interests. But the reality is that anytime you do sanctions, for them to be effective, they can't only just cause them pain, they have to cause you pain for them to actually have, you can't cause them pain without yourself experiencing some deprivation of economic exchange. The only thing that I can think of that might be less painful is if we start seizing oligarch assets in London, New York, Vancouver, or wherever they happen to be. You seize rich people's property. I'm not sure that really is that costly. But anything beyond that, if we kick Russia off of the SWIFT code system, that means that Russia can't bank with Russian companies can't bank with Canadian, American, whoever companies, which means that those companies then can't get their money for whatever they transacted with Russian firms. So, doing that would be costly. Also, it could encourage Russia and China to find a substitute, which they eventually would do. But likewise, the Russians, by doing this, are going to encourage the Europeans to find substitutes to Russian gas. And so that's going to, this is bad for Russia down the road, because everybody's going to become much more independent from Russia. So it's going to cost everybody something.
Right. Part of this, Putin's excuse has been to not see the expansion of NATO, but I just watched an interview with the former Prime Minister of Finland, who says this is pretty much going to push Finland into NATO. What does that kind of calculation start looking like for some of these other non-aligned countries?
Well, that's the thing is that NATO was in decline in 2014. It was already pulling out of Afghanistan. It sort of lost its purpose. European countries were reducing their defense budgets. The Americans were pulling out their military out of Europe because they wanted to focus on the Asian threat, that is China. And then when Putin went into Crimea and seized Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, that led to more defense spending on the part of NATO countries. NATO's putting troops into the Baltics. There hadn't been any NATO bases in the Baltics or in Poland before that. And so that's the nature of international relations. You threaten somebody, they respond. They don't usually cave in. And so by being more threatening now, it's going to cause lots of Russia's neighbors to ponder alternatives. And Finland and Sweden thus far have gone along with not being in any alliance, but being very close to NATO in a variety of ways. Like Sweden sent more troops to Afghanistan than a number of the NATO countries. So he may be causing stuff that he doesn't want, but that's the nature of irredentism. This thing that he's doing of trying to reunify lost territory is a process that often causes bad things to happen to those who start it. One could track Somalia's current misery back to the efforts by various Somali leaders to engage in a greater Somalia project in the 1970s. In the 1990s, you had Croatia and Serbia engaged in dueling irredentisms, where Serbia was trying to poach Serb-inhabited territory in both Bosnia and Croatia, while Croatia was trying to poach Croatian-inhabited territory in Bosnia at the same time. So, and this is, nationalist, and it is for domestic political purposes, but it's often not really all that smart or clever from the standpoint of international relations, because countries react. Nobody, very few countries go, "Oh, you want part of my territory? Go ahead, take it." No, everybody usually get resistance, and that resistance leads to war.
And Irredentism was one of your previous books too, wasn't it?
That's right. The book is called For Kin or Country, and the title was very deliberately to suggest there's a trade-off between supporting one's kin abroad versus doing what is best for your country. And sometimes you choose your country, which means you don't engage in the stuff, or sometimes you choose your kin, and that means that your country pays the price. And the Russian people are going to pay a price for this through everything is going to cost more in terms of imports. They're not going to get some imports from various places. The money that's going to be spent on the war that's going to be very costly. If they actually win, and I do think that they'll probably win in the short term of defeating the Ukrainian military, then they're going to have to occupy the place. Well, we found out for ourselves that occupation is hard and costly, and the Russian economy is not as robust as the American economy. So it's going to be very costly for the Russian people. And Putin has already seen lots of protests around the country, which I don't think he was expecting.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I seem to recall reading is that Russia has a demographic problem as well, which I don't think this is going to really help them either with.
You mean that they've had a declining life mortality rate, that people their lives are getting shorter and shorter?
Yeah.
That's a real problem. I mean, that's also they've been losing people both through immigration as well. It's not that people are moving to Russia because Russia is such a great place. They've been leaving Russia, and also the life expectancy of a man in Russia is much lower than in most places in Europe, and so this is not going to help that. War tends to be harmful for that. So yeah, I mean, this would be very costly, and I'm not exactly sure in the end who Putin is playing towards. He is trying to evoke symbols of Russian nationalism to try to bring people on his side. So the reason why he's talking about denazification is because he's trying to invoke the mythology and symbolism of the Great Patriotic War, the big time defeat of the Nazis by what was the Soviet Union, but in Russian nationalism was the Russian people. And he's trying to invoke that to unify the Russians on his side. But, we've seen a lot of protests, and that you wouldn't expect that, because protest in Russia is a much more challenging, risky endeavor than protest in lots of other places. So it's taking a lot of guts by people, but they're doing it anyway. But it's not going to be easy to remove Putin from power. And it's not, and if he were removed, I'm not certain that who replaced him would be that much better.
I guess from a Canadian perspective, what else can we do in this kind of situation? I mean, we're escalating sanctions kind of in a drip by drip manner, and my read of that is it's more what we're able to get our allies on side with for each successive sanction, because unless everyone's on board, then there's just loopholes that Russia can exploit. But what else is there? I mean, we're talking about shoring up our position in Latvia, where we're doing reassurance slash being a speed bump, essentially. Sorry?
A tripwire. Speed bump
Tripwire. That's what I'm looking for. Tripwire.
Yes.
So what else should Canada be doing in this kind of a situation?
Well, the first thing is we need to be humble about what we can do, which is that we can't really move the needle much by ourselves. And we really can't move that needle much, even if everybody cooperates with each other, because even if NATO levies sanctions, NATO members agree to levy sanctions against Russia, and they have, they'll make an impact, but China's not going to be sanctioning Russia that much, although there was a bit of that today. But chances are China, India is probably not going to sanction Russia either. So there's going to be big gaps in the sanctions. So it's going to raise the price for doing business for Russia, but it's not going to be fatal. They'll find other ways to get what they need. So we can, make it harder for them to do business. We can seize the property. We can make it harder on individuals, and that's what we've been doing the past 10 years or 15 years, is having smarter sanctions where we target individuals as opposed to targeting entire countries, because we learned from the sanctions against Iraq from 1991 to 2003, sanctioning entire people is not going to change what the rulers are doing potentially, but it is ruinous to people who really have no power. So the average Russian can't do anything about this. So it doesn't make sense to punish them too much, but they're going to pay a price for it anyway. What more can we do? There's not a whole lot more we can do, because, again, we don't want to get involved in a shooting war with Russia. So we can ship arms to Ukraine. We can take in more refugees, maybe keep the promises that we didn't really keep with the Afghans, keep them with the Ukrainians. So there's things like that we can do. We could give money to, relief agencies, so that way they can take care of the people who are flooding across the border, whether that's Red Cross or other agencies like that. We can do things like that, but we can't stop this.
Yeah.
And the United States can't stop it. Nobody can really stop it, because we don't want to have a war with Russia, and that's what it would take. We can impose costs, and maybe those costs will eventually resonate and cause some domestic actors in Russia to push back at Putin. But there's no quick fixes to this.
And I guess my last question is, some of the commentary I've seen around is basically wishing for the glory days of the 80s, that if we had Thatcher and Reagan and Mulroney, that Putin wouldn't dare do this kind of thing. And I kind of roll my eyes at this. You probably got a better read of history than I do. And I just I thought, give me your take on this particular fantasy notion.
Well, I think it mattered that, for instance, the United States for 4 years had a president who was very sympathetic to Russia, that had a national security advisor who seemed to be then and now again on the payroll of the Russians. That would be retired Lieutenant General Mike Flynn. So I think it was easier for Putin for 4 years, certainly. But the structure of the situation is what it is, which is, this is a territory much closer to Russia than it is to us. It's much more important politically to Russia than it's to us. And so it's hard for us to have leverage over it. And one of the basic challenges of the nuclear era is that when both sides have nuclear weapons, we have them, the Russians have them, we can't really promise to use our nuclear weapons if they do something like invade Ukraine. Because they can say, well, if you do that, then we'll use our nuclear weapons. So we're both frozen by the higher level nuclear weapons, but at the lower level, it creates room for the more adventurous to engage in risk-taking. And authoritarian regimes, such as Putin's, can engage in more risk-taking, because if he loses a gamble, he doesn't lose power necessarily.
Yeah.
Slobodan Milosevic, who led Serbia during its era of Irredentism, I lost track of how many wars he lost. But he lost several wars, and it took a number of years before he got kicked out of power. He started his adventures in 1991. He finally lost power, I think, in the year 2000 after Kosovo. And an American or Canadian leader who launches a bunch of wars wouldn't last past the first one if there was a complete failure.
Yeah.
So this means that Putin can gamble in ways that we cannot, and that's true whether it was Reagan or Thatcher being the one staring him in the face. And that, the thing about the Cold War was that the Soviets never left their zone, right? Not the Cold War, the Iron Curtain fell exactly where Russian or Soviet troops were standing at the end of World War II, not beyond it. And so Ukraine was kind of that gray area because it was not a member of NATO, but it had always been in the Russian sphere of influence, the Soviet sphere of influence. And so it's something we can't really do too much with. But that does leave me one thing I want to remind people about. This is really not about NATO.
Yeah.
It's really about Ukraine being democratic and west-leaning, as opposed to being autocratic and east-leaning. That as long as Ukraine was doing well, it was serving as a bad role model in Putin's eyes for Russia, for Belarus, for Kazakhstan, for other countries in the Russian area of influence. And so it was less about whether they would join NATO. That wasn't going to happen anytime soon. And much more about the dangerous role model that Ukraine was playing. And the moves in 2014 was one effort to try to control events in Ukraine by seizing Crimea, by inventing essentially separatist movements in the Donbass region. And that seemed to work for a short period of time where it dominated Ukrainian politics. But then Ukraine did something strange, which is rather than electing far-right nationalist leaders to push back, they elected Democrats and a Jewish comedian. And was very popular. And his popularity obviously has gone up in the last few days as he's really been a powerful leader for Ukraine. And so that was really the danger that Ukraine posed for Russia, was the domestic political implications. And so this is really about regime change, and it's not about NATO. And so we have to keep that in mind.
All right. Well, thanks so much for helping us put this into context and giving us some stuff to think about, because this is going to be, pretty much what everyone's talking about for the next few weeks. So thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.
My pleasure, Dale.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.